The Perfect Trap. Chapter 1. The Gut Feeling. The camera pans across an empty kitchen, clean, organized, but hauntingly still. This was the heart of her home, where she once felt safe. Now, it was a battleground of silent suspicions and a growing void between her and the man she thought she knew. For 12 years, I trusted him. We built a life together. We were a team, a family. But something changed, and I didn't see it coming. Rachel had always trusted Dan. From the moment they met, everything felt right, almost fated. Their life together had been like a picture-perfect postcard. A cozy home in the suburbs, 2 wonderful kids, and a marriage that, to everyone on the outside, seemed unshakable. The kind of marriage others envied. For over a decade, they had shared the ordinary moments, late-night talks, family vacations, birthday parties, and the extraordinary ones too. They were partners in every sense of the word, or so she believed. But in the last 6 months, Rachel noticed something she couldn't quite put into words. Dan had changed. It wasn't sudden, more like a subtle drift, almost unnoticeable at first. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. It began with him working late more often than usual. Then came the growing distance, small moments when he seemed lost in thought, detached, like he wasn't really there with her anymore. When she kissed him goodbye in the mornings, the warmth had faded. His once affectionate gestures now felt rehearsed, as if he were playing the role of a good husband rather than being one. Rachel wanted to believe it was just the stress of work. Dan had taken on a big new client at his firm. That had to be the reason for the change, right? She convinced herself that things would get better once the project was over, that it was just a phase they'd weather together. But the truth gnawed at her, quietly, relentlessly. Over coffee one morning, Rachel confided in her best friend, Alice. "I can't shake this feeling," she said, stirring her cup absent-mindedly. They sat at a small cafe down the street, a place they had frequented for years. But today, something was different. Rachel's voice trembled, her eyes shadowed with doubt. "What feeling?" Alice asked, her brows knitting together with concern. Rachel hesitated, as if speaking the words out loud would make them too real. "It's Dan. He's been so distant. It's like he's here, but he's not here, you know? And he's working late more than ever. I don't know. I just feel like something's off." Alice leaned forward. "Have you asked him about it?" Rachel shook her head. "Not yet. I don't want to seem paranoid, especially if it's just work stress. But," she trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I don't know him anymore." Alice didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached out, gently squeezing Rachel's hand. "You're not paranoid, Rach. You know your husband. Trust your instincts." Rachel nodded, though her heart sank. That was the problem. She had been trusting her instincts, and they were telling her something she wasn't ready to face. That night, as Rachel lay in bed beside Dan, she stared at the ceiling, listening to his slow, even breathing. He was fast asleep, lost in a peaceful dream, while she lay wide awake, trapped in her own nightmare of doubt. The clock on the bedside table flashed 1:45 a.m. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint rustling of leaves outside their window. Rachel's mind raced, replaying the past few months over and over again. Was it all in her head? Was she imagining things? Or was there something more? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft buzz. Dan's phone, which lay on the nightstand next to her, lit up with a new notification. Rachel glanced at it, her breath catching in her throat. The screen glowed in the darkness, casting an eerie light across the room. She didn't usually snoop through his things. Trust was the cornerstone of their relationship, after all. But tonight, something was different. The nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't let her ignore it any longer. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. The screen showed a text message from someone named Lily. Rachel's heart dropped. The name meant nothing to her. It wasn't one of Dan's colleagues, nor was it a friend she'd ever met. But it was the time of the message that unsettled her the most, 2 a.m. What kind of woman texts a married man at this hour? Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. She didn't open the message. Not yet. She placed the phone back on the nightstand, carefully, quietly. She couldn't confront Dan without solid proof, without knowing what was really going on. Accusations without evidence could backfire, and she wasn't going to give him the chance to twist the truth. No, she needed to be sure. And to do that, she needed a plan. The next morning, Rachel watched Dan as he got ready for work. He moved through their bedroom with the same easy confidence he always had, unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. He smiled at her as he pulled on his jacket, kissed her on the cheek before leaving, just like he always did. But to Rachel, everything felt different. His smile seemed forced. The kiss, mechanical. For the first time in their marriage, she questioned whether he was pretending. Was this all just a show? Had it been for months? Her heart raced as she picked up her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd need. Alice had given it to her. Someone discreet, someone who could help her find the truth without Dan ever knowing. Marvin Investigations, a calm, professional voice answered on the other end of the line. How can I help you? Rachel swallowed hard, her throat dry. I need your help. I think my husband is cheating. The following day, Rachel met Marvin, the private investigator, at a small cafe on the other side of town. She didn't want anyone she knew seeing her, didn't want to raise any suspicions. The idea of hiring a PI felt foreign, like something out of a crime drama, not her real life. But her gut told her she had no choice. Marvin was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Perfect for the job, Rachel supposed. He listened as she explained her situation, nodding thoughtfully. I understand what you're going through, Mrs. Jennings, Marvin said. I've handled cases like this before. If something's going on, we'll find it. We'll set up hidden cameras, track his movements, and monitor his communication. If he's seeing someone else, we'll know soon enough. Rachel nodded, her hands clenching her coffee cup tightly. She hated that it had come to this, but what choice did she have? She needed the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. How long will it take? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hard to say, Marvin replied. Sometimes it takes a few days, sometimes a few weeks. But don't worry, we'll find out. Rachel left the cafe with a knot in her stomach. She was crossing a line she never thought she would, but she knew it was the only way to get the answers she needed. The perfect trap was set. Days passed in a haze of routine, each one blending into the next. Rachel played her part perfectly, smiling when she needed to, laughing at Dan's jokes, pretending everything was fine. But underneath, she was unraveling. Every time he came home late, every time he checked his phone a little too quickly, her suspicions grew. But she had to be patient. She couldn't let him know she was onto him. The cameras were rolling now. The investigator was watching. It was only a matter of time. Then, one afternoon, Marvin called. Mrs. Jennings, I think we found something, he said, his voice steady, professional. But Rachel's heart raced. What is it? She asked, her hand trembling as she gripped the phone. There are photos. I'll send them to you now. Rachel opened her email, her stomach in knots. And there it was, the truth, staring her in the face. Dan, arm in arm with a woman outside a restaurant. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders as she laughed at something he said. It wasn't just the image of them together that hurt. It was the ease, the familiarity between them, the closeness that should have been reserved for her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Rachel stared at the photo. The air felt thick, her chest tight. It was real. Everything she had feared was real. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers. But she held back. She couldn't let him know what she knew. Not yet. Not until she had everything in place. That night, she lay in bed beside Dan, her body rigid with tension as he slept soundly next to her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to shake him awake and ask him why. Why he had betrayed her. Why he had lied. But instead, she stayed quiet. She wasn't ready to confront him yet. Not until she had the perfect plan. And that's when it hit her, the party. Their anniversary was coming up in just a few weeks. Every year, they hosted a big celebration with friends and family. It was a tradition. But this year, things would be different. This year, Rachel would turn the tables on Dan. The trap was set, and soon, he'd walk right into it. Rachel smiled to herself, a sense of calm washing over her for the first time in weeks. She wasn't just a victim in this story. She was the one in control now. Dan wouldn't see it coming. Chapter 2. The Plan. Rachel had always been practical. She wasn't the kind of woman who reacted impulsively or let her emotions dictate her decisions. After all, for 12 years, she and Dan had built a life together. A life rooted in stability, trust, and predictability. If she was going to confront him now, she needed to be sure. Solid proof. It wasn't just about catching him in a lie. It was about safeguarding her children, ensuring their future, and above all, making sure their marriage ended on her terms, not his. The seed of doubt had been planted the night she saw that text from Lily at 2 a.m. It wasn't just a one-off. Something in her gut told her this was bigger, deeper. But accusations wouldn't get her anywhere, not without undeniable proof. Sitting in her kitchen that morning, sipping cold coffee that had long since lost its warmth, she made up her mind. She needed help, discreet help, and if Dan was going to lie to her, she would catch him. Slowly, methodically. She picked up the phone and dialed Alice. Alice didn't hesitate. "Rachel, I know someone. He's helped people in situations like this before. He's quiet, professional. You won't need to worry about a thing," Alice said, her voice steady, but laced with the concern of a friend who couldn't believe this was happening. Rachel felt a surge of guilt. Had it really come to this? Hiring a private investigator? In all her years with Dan, she had never imagined she'd find herself in this position. But there was no turning back now. If she was wrong, if this was all in her head, at least she would have peace of mind. But if she was right, she couldn't bear to think about what that would mean for her marriage, her kids, her life. Later that day, Alice texted her the investigator's contact information. Marvin Investigations. Just seeing the name on her phone screen made the whole thing feel more real, like a sharp stab to the heart. But she knew what she had to do. Rachel called. The first time she heard Marvin's voice, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. He wasn't what she expected. There was no slick, movie-style detective with a trench coat and a fedora. Marvin was professional, collected, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Mrs. Jennings, I understand how difficult this is for you. Believe me, I've handled many cases like this. We'll get the evidence you need," Marvin said with an almost clinical precision, but his tone was kind, steady. How does this work?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking just enough to betray her composure. "We'll install cameras in places he won't notice. Small, discreet. If there's something going on in the house, we'll catch it. Outside the house, I'll have one of my team follow him. Nothing invasive, just to see where he goes, who he meets. If there's anything suspicious, you'll know." Rachel nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Her mind swirled with the weight of it all, but there was an odd comfort in knowing she was doing something, taking control of the situation. "How long does this take?" she asked, barely able to recognize her own voice. "It varies. Sometimes we get results in a few days. Other times, it can take a few weeks. But if there's something happening, we'll know." There was a long silence on the line, and then Rachel whispered, "Thank you." The next few days felt like walking a tightrope. Rachel had to play the part, the perfect wife, clueless and trusting. She couldn't let Dan suspect anything. If he sensed even a flicker of doubt in her, he might cover his tracks, and the chance to catch him would vanish. She smiled at him like she always did, made his lunches, kissed him goodbye before he left for work. And every day, as she watched him pull out of the driveway, her heart broke just a little more. In the evenings, she listened as he told her about his day. His tone was normal, casual, but now, every word he said felt like a lie. The man she had shared her life with for so long suddenly felt like a stranger. And all the while, the cameras were rolling. Chapter 3. Close Calls. Days turned into weeks. Each morning brought a fresh wave of tension that settled deep in Rachel's bones. She checked her email religiously, waiting for updates from Marvin, bracing herself for what she might find. Every ding of her phone sent her heart racing. And then, finally, it happened. One evening, as Rachel sat alone in the kitchen, a new message popped up in her inbox. She stared at it for a moment, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might confirm. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the email, and her breath caught in her throat. The subject line read, "Photos, urgent." Rachel's stomach twisted. She opened the email, and there it was, a snapshot of Dan. He was standing outside a restaurant, laughing, with his arm draped around a woman's shoulders. The woman was tall, blonde, stunning in a sleek black dress. Rachel didn't have to wonder who she was. She knew instantly. Lily. It was like a punch to the gut. She stared at the photo, her heart pounding in her ears. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. It was one thing to suspect. It was another thing entirely to see it laid out in front of her like this. Undeniable proof that the man she had built her life with was leading a double life. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she felt a strange calm wash over her. This was what she had been waiting for. The proof. And now that she had it, she wasn't going to waste it. She wouldn't act. Not yet. Rachel continued to collect evidence over the next few weeks, each new piece adding to the weight on her chest. Dan wasn't just cheating. He was building a whole other life with this woman. She knew now that Lily wasn't just some fling. This wasn't a one-night stand or a midlife crisis. Dan was in deep, and the betrayal cut deeper than she ever imagined it would. But she couldn't act too soon. If she confronted him now, it would just be a fight. A screaming match where he would deny everything, twist the truth, and somehow make her feel like she was the one who had lost her mind. No, Rachel needed to be sure. She needed to have every detail in place before she made her move. And she had the perfect opportunity coming up, their anniversary party. Every year, they threw a big celebration with family and friends, a tradition they had started early in their marriage. This year, she would keep the tradition alive. Only this time, the party would have a little surprise. But keeping up the act was harder than she expected. Every time Dan came home late, every time he checked his phone and smiled at a message, Rachel felt like she was teetering on the edge of an abyss. Her chest tightened with the weight of keeping the secret, but she couldn't break. Not yet. And then, there were the close calls. One afternoon, Rachel sat in her home office, reviewing footage from one of the hidden cameras Marvin had installed. It was a mundane clip, just Dan moving around the kitchen, texting, making coffee. She fast-forwarded, scanning the footage for anything out of place. Suddenly, she heard footsteps in the hallway, Dan's footsteps. Her heart raced. She scrambled to close the laptop, her hands fumbling with the keys as panic shot through her. She had been so focused on the footage that she hadn't heard him come home. The door to the office creaked open, and Dan walked in, his eyes locking onto her. Rachel froze, trying to keep her expression neutral, but her heart was pounding in her chest. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her, his gaze a little too sharp for her liking. "What are you working on?" he asked casually, though his tone held an undercurrent of suspicion. Rachel forced a smile, quickly sliding the laptop shut. "Just some stuff for the kids' school fundraiser," she lied smoothly, hoping he couldn't hear the thudding of her heart. "How was work?" Dan shrugged, but his eyes lingered on her longer than she would have liked. "Busy, as usual." Rachel nodded, still smiling, praying he would leave the room. "Glad you're home," she added, leaning back in her chair. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, as if trying to read her thoughts. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. After what felt like an eternity, Dan finally turned and left the room. Rachel exhaled, her shoulders slumping with relief. She had narrowly avoided disaster. If Dan had seen the footage on her laptop, if he had found out she was spying on him, everything would have fallen apart. The trap she was setting would have been ruined. And she couldn't let that happen. Every day the tension grew, coiling tighter and tighter inside Rachel as she walked the tightrope of deception. She was playing a dangerous game, one that required her to be perfect in every move she made. One slip, one wrong word, and everything could come crashing down. But she couldn't stop now. The anniversary party was just around the corner, and it would be the night she'd reveal everything. The proof, the betrayal, all of it. In front of their friends, their family, Dan would have no way out. It was the perfect trap, and he was about to walk right into it. Chapter 4. The Anniversary Party. The night had arrived. For weeks, Rachel had been preparing for this moment, her perfect trap. But now, standing in the center of her living room, surrounded by friends and family, she felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anticipation, dread, sadness. This was supposed to be a celebration of love, of 12 years of marriage, but for Rachel, it was something far more sinister. Everything was ready. The house was glowing with soft lights, laughter filled the air, and the hum of conversation swirled around her. She could hear the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional bursts of laughter from old friends reminiscing about the past. To everyone else, tonight was just another anniversary party, a celebration of her and Dan's love. But not to her. Rachel felt a cold sweat building at the back of her neck as she glanced around the room. Dan was by the bar, talking to some of his work friends, looking relaxed and confident. His smile was wide, the kind that used to make her feel secure and loved. But now, she saw it for what it really was, arrogance. He had no idea that tonight, everything was about to change. And then there was Lily. Rachel's eyes landed on her across the room, standing by the buffet table, casually chatting with one of Dan's colleagues. She looked beautiful as always. Tall, blonde, and effortlessly elegant, she stood out in her sleek black dress. Rachel felt a wave of nausea roll through her as she watched her, knowing that Lily wasn't just some innocent guest. Dan had invited her, of course. He'd been so confident that Rachel didn't suspect a thing. But Rachel had been planning this moment for weeks. She had played her role flawlessly, pretending to be the oblivious wife, smiling, laughing, even asking Lily to help with the party planning. She had made sure everything appeared normal, even as her heart shattered a little more every day. The cameras had captured everything. The lies, the betrayal, the nights Dan spent with Lily when he claimed to be working late. And now, she was ready to reveal the truth. It was time. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. She glanced down at the champagne flute in her hand, watching the bubbles rise and pop at the surface. Her hands were trembling, but she couldn't afford to falter now. This was her moment. Dan caught her eye from across the room and smiled, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. He walked over, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You okay, babe?" he asked, leaning in to kiss her cheek. His touch made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to smile. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm fine." The room quieted as Rachel stepped to the center, glass in hand. Everyone turned their attention to her, waiting for the traditional anniversary speech. It was a moment she had lived through many times before, but this year, it felt like stepping onto a stage she no longer belonged on. Rachel cleared her throat and smiled at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice sounding warmer than she felt. 12 years of marriage. It's hard to believe how fast time flies. We've shared so many wonderful memories, and we're so lucky to have friends and family like you all to celebrate with us. The crowd clapped politely, lifting their glasses in a toast. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. She glanced at Dan, who was standing beside her, his smile broad, his eyes sparkling with pride. He had no idea what was about to happen. Rachel's hands tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. She set the glass down on the table beside her and took a deep breath. Her heart raced as the moment approached, the moment she would reveal everything. "And before we cut the cake," she continued, her voice growing quieter, more serious, "I have something I want to share with all of you." Dan's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. He probably thought she was about to make a sentimental gesture, a slideshow of their family vacations, perhaps, or a heartfelt video of their wedding day. He had no idea what was coming. Rachel turned to face the TV behind her, where her laptop was already connected. The remote was in her hand, hidden discreetly behind her back. With one click, she brought the screen to life. The room darkened, the sound of conversation fading into tense silence as everyone's attention shifted to the glowing screen. "I want to share a video with all of you," Rachel said, her voice steady but tight. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her face calm. She pressed play. The room was silent as the footage began to roll. At first, there was nothing but grainy footage of an empty room, their living room. Rachel could hear the faint rustling of clothes, the sound of someone entering the house. And then, there they were. Dan and Lily. Gasps filled the room as the footage played on. It wasn't subtle, either. The two of them were laughing, wrapped in each other's arms, kissing like they were the only two people in the world. They looked like a couple in love, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Rachel's chest tightened as she watched her husband, the man she had shared 12 years of her life with, wrap his arms around another woman, kissing her deeply, holding her like she was his whole world. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was something real, something deep. The room erupted into shocked whispers, gasps, and murmurs of disbelief. Rachel could hear her friends and family whispering to each other, their voices sharp with shock and confusion. What is this?" Dan's voice broke through the chaos. He had turned pale, his face drained of color as he stared at the screen in horror. His eyes darted around the room, filled with panic as he realized what was happening. He took a step toward Rachel, but she held up her hand to stop him. "What is this?" he repeated, his voice shaky now, the mask of confidence he had worn all night slipping away. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his hands trembling at his sides. Rachel turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face calm and composed. "It's exactly what it looks like, Dan," she said quietly. "It's you and Lily." Dan stammered, his voice shaky and defensive. "Rachel, it's not what it looks like. I can explain. It's a mistake." Rachel felt a surge of fury rise within her, but she kept her voice level. "A mistake? I don't think so. This has been going on for months, hasn't it?" Dan opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Lily, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, stepping forward. "Rachel, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It's been going on for a year. I didn't mean for you to find out this way." The room was silent. All eyes were on the three of them, Rachel, Dan, and Lily, standing in the middle of the room like actors in a twisted play. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't break down. Not yet. She looked around the room at her friends and family, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. And then she turned back to Dan, who stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I trusted you," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "For 12 years, I trusted you. I believed in you. And this is how you repay me?" Dan didn't respond. He stood there, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. But there were no right words. There was nothing he could say to fix this, to take back the months of lies, the nights spent with another woman. Rachel took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had done it. The truth was out. The perfect trap had been sprung, and now Dan had no way out. She turned to face the guests, her voice steady as she spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "But I think the party's over." Without another word, she walked out of the room, leaving Dan and Lily behind in the wreckage of their own making. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the betrayal hanging heavy in the air. But for Rachel, as she walked out of that house, she felt lighter than she had in months. The truth was finally out. The marriage she thought she had was gone, but now, so was the lie. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Chapter 5. The Denial. Dan's world was crumbling around him, but the man had always been a skilled manipulator. His instinct for self-preservation kicked in almost immediately as the damning footage played out before their stunned guests. The room was heavy with disbelief, a murmur of shocked voices filling the air, but all Dan could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. His first reaction was denial. Swift, automatic, and desperate. "This isn't what it looks like," Dan shouted, his voice shaking but growing louder, trying to drown out the gasps and murmurs of disbelief. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward Rachel, as if his touch could somehow erase everything she had just shown. "Rachel, I swear to God, you're misunderstanding this. She's just a friend. We've worked together, that's all. Someone's trying to frame me." He scanned the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, anyone who might believe him. His friends, family, colleagues, people who had known him for years, stared back, wide-eyed, their expressions a mix of confusion and betrayal. But no one spoke up. No one defended him. Dan's desperation grew. "Come on, Rachel. You know me. This isn't real. Someone must have doctored this footage. Maybe one of my competitors at work. They're trying to make me look bad. This isn't what you think it is." But even as he said the words, he could feel his grip on the situation slipping. The panic in his voice was palpable now, his confidence unraveling as the silence around him grew heavier. The footage of him and Lily, so intimate, so undeniable, played on a loop in the minds of everyone in the room. Rachel, however, didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her face unreadable, as if she had been preparing for this very moment for weeks, which, in truth, she had. Dan's words washed over her like static, the noise of a man trying desperately to save himself from drowning in his own lies. She had expected this. She knew he would try to twist the truth, to manipulate her emotions, and somehow turn the blame on her. But it didn't matter now. She felt nothing. Dan's voice wavered as he turned back to the guests, pleading with them now. "Come on, guys. You know me. You've known me for years. You know I would never do something like this to Rachel, to my family. This whole thing is just a misunderstanding." The guests remained frozen, uncertain of how to react, their eyes darting between Dan and Rachel. Some looked horrified, others pitying, and a few simply averted their gazes, unable to meet his eyes. It was as if they were watching a train wreck in slow motion, powerless to stop it. As Dan's frantic words filled the room, Lily, who had been standing in stunned silence, her face pale, suddenly broke down. The pressure of the moment, the weight of the lies, was too much for her to bear. She couldn't hold it in any longer. "It's true," Lily sobbed, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. She covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head as she spoke, the guilt spilling out of her like a flood she couldn't control. "It's all true. We've been seeing each other for over a year. I can't lie anymore." Dan froze, his face going pale as Lily's words hung in the air, sharp and damning. The gasps from the crowd grew louder, and all eyes turned to Lily as she crumbled under the weight of the truth. Her sobs echoed in the stunned silence, her body trembling with the force of her confession. "I'm sorry, Rachel," Lily continued, her voice thick with guilt and shame. "I never wanted it to be like this. I never wanted you to find out this way. But Dan, he's been lying to you for a long time." Rachel's expression didn't change, but inside, her heart twisted at the confirmation of what she had already known deep down. She had suspected the affair had been going on for months, but hearing Lily say it, hearing the betrayal laid bare, still felt like a punch to the gut. Dan, for the first time, was completely silent. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. He looked like a man caught in the spotlight, frozen in his own guilt, unable to move or react. But Lily wasn't done. Her guilt, her panic, pushed her to confess even more than Rachel had ever expected. "It wasn't just me," Lily cried, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Rachel, you deserve to know the truth. Dan's been seeing other women too. It's not just me. He's been doing this for years." The room erupted in shocked gasps, whispers spreading like wildfire. Even Rachel, who had been prepared for the worst, felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Other women? Years? Dan's face crumbled as the full weight of Lily's confession hit him. His carefully constructed lies, the web of deceit he had spun for so long, were unraveling in front of everyone. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for any sign of hope, any possibility of escape. But there was none. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. Chapter 6. The Triumph. Rachel stood there, her heart pounding, but her face remained calm. Inside, she felt a swirl of emotions, rage, sadness, betrayal, but she refused to let any of them show. Not now, not in front of Dan. He had taken enough from her. He didn't deserve to see her break. Instead, she drew herself up, her voice cold and steady as she turned to face him. "Dan," she said, her words slicing through the tension in the room like a blade. "We're done?" Dan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at her, wide-eyed, as if the finality of her words hadn't fully registered yet. Rachel didn't give him a chance to respond. She had all the proof she needed. There was no need for a screaming match, no need to waste another second of her life on his lies. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," she continued, her voice cold and even. "The divorce papers are ready. I have custody of the kids, the house, and everything else." Dan's face crumpled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But there was nothing he could say. The man who had spent years manipulating her, gaslighting her, making her question her own sanity, was now completely powerless. Rachel didn't wait for him to respond. She turned her attention to the room full of friends and family, her voice steady and calm as she spoke to them. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of their guests. "But the party's over." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Dan standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. The silence behind her was deafening, but Rachel didn't look back. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, a weight lifted from her shoulders, a weight she had been carrying for far too long. The truth was out, and the lie she had been living was finally over. But the most liberating truth of all was this: Rachel had been planning to leave Dan long before she ever found out about the affair. The betrayal had only confirmed what she had known deep down for years. Her marriage had been over for a long time. She had stayed for the kids, for the life they had built together. But now she realized that staying had been a mistake. Dan had taken enough from her, but he wouldn't take any more. His lies, his betrayal, had only strengthened her resolve. She was finally free. Free from the lies. Free from the manipulation. Free from the man she once thought she knew. As she walked down the driveway, the cold air filling her lungs, Rachel felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And for the first time in years, she was ready to take control of her life. She didn't need Dan anymore. She never had. Rachel's triumph was not in exposing Dan's lies, but in reclaiming her life. She had been trapped for too long, but now the door was open, and she was stepping through it, into a future of her own making. Finally free. Epilogue: New beginnings. Months later, Rachel sat in her new home, a quiet smile playing on her lips as she watched her children playing in the yard. She had left Dan behind, and with him, the pain of the past. Her life was hers again, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. The affair hadn't broken her. It had set her free. As she reflected on everything that had happened, Rachel realized something important. Sometimes, it's the things we don't see coming that set us on the path we were meant to walk all along. In the epilogue, Rachel's journey culminates in a triumphant celebration of resilience and self-discovery. Her quiet smile while watching her children play signifies hope and the reclamation of her identity after leaving Dan. The phrase, "the affair hadn't broken her," it had set her free, uncovers how challenges can lead to profound personal growth. This empowering conclusion inspires viewers to embrace their own paths of healing, reminding us that new beginnings can emerge from even the darkest moments.